well, and then we'll go into intros. I want to be respectful of time. This is, for me, a momentous opportunity to have us come together as a region and embrace a particular item, whether out of JLARC or from the governor's budget, that we can get our arms around and jointly advocate for, that would be beneficial to us all. And so I'm excited about this possibility. This is a first for us, really. So we will, Jim, you want to say anything?
Sure.
We'll do intros.
I would, just as a housekeeping thing, if you haven't been here before, the mics are in the ceiling and the room's large. So if you can just speak up when you're talking so that we can make sure everybody's able to be heard, that would be appreciated. Again, I want to thank Martha and Plan RVA for hosting this forum. I know many of us are commissioners for Plan RVA, but this is not technically a Plan RVA meeting. It is taking the synergies that come out of what Plan RVA does and continuing to work together to the betterment of the region by doing it collaboratively. And I'm excited about it as well. I've been talking about this for at least 3 years at the local level, but I had to get my own jurisdiction on board, meaning I don't know what every jurisdiction is going through, but Chesterfield had schools in the county, or the governing body and the school board, not on the same page and fighting each other, instead of realizing that the fight shouldn't be with each other. The fight should be each other united, going to where we need to go, which is the state, which is the primary underfunded source to education. And it's taken several years, but in Chesterfield County, both boards have been able to work together well, and we finally got to the same page where our school board put out their legislative program. Our county board has fully endorsed that. We have copies of that if anybody like to get it digitally or in print, if they want to look at how that works together. But we are finally seem to be on the same page that they've acknowledged that they still have funding issues, but they no longer are coming at the county as being the major source of their issue. And they realize the synergies and working together. But we realized, and I've shared with them, that we can't just do that at the local level. Because if just Chesterfield County advocates to just Chesterfield County's delegates and the other jurisdictions aren't doing the same thing, it's not going to be a priority at the state level. And I think all of us have been guilty of fighting this at home and not working together at home and together as a region, and quite frankly, together with all the partners throughout the state to make this a priority. And if we don't do that, this JLARC study, which is really eye-opening, Chesterfield County alone, as we had a presentation, with very minimal additional funding from the county, would bring in $226.7 million more in funding just for Chesterfield County. And as I think we'll hear a little bit, the governor's budget only has approximately $400 million more in education.
For the whole state.
For the whole state, for the whole state. And that shows that we still have a lot of work to do. And if we don't do it together, we're not going to get there. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to work collaboratively with our partners to bring this eye-opening report to life and have something come out of it. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being here.
I'd like to just take a moment to also, so thank you, Jim, because all of that's accurate. I was just trying to, before we got into the meat of it, just to go around the room, and if you would introduce yourself, which entities you represent, et cetera.
I'm Suzette Denslow. I'm the City of Richmond's Intergovernmental Affairs Director.
I'm Megan Field. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for the city. Work closely with Suzette on Intergovernmental Affairs.
Eva Colin, Senior Policy Advisor for the City of Richmond, and I lead our Office of Children and Families.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Stanley. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Outreach for Richmond Public Schools.
Natalie Spillman with Chesterfield County. I'm our Intergovernmental Relations Director.
Brett Chardine, Powhatan County, County Administrator.
Mike Sherman, Intergovernmental Relations for Henrico County.
Jonathan Lau, Goochland Board of Supervisors.
Nick Carpenter, Goochland County Administrator.
I'm Brent Chambers, Town of Ashland's Planning Commission.
And I'm Mark Miller. I'm the Midlothian Supervisor for Chesterfield County, a former high school English teacher, and really looking forward to doing this. And thank you, Jim, for pulling this together, and Cynthia.
Okay.
Mr. Addison, if you would introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you for starting it off for me. Andres Addison. I have the honor of serving on City Council with Dr. Newbill.
And if we could, the folks in the back, if you would introduce yourselves.
Kathy Bircher with Advanced Strategies and the former Deputy Secretary of Education under the previous administration.
Paul Drumright, Community Affairs Manager for Goochland County.
Terry Ramos, Plan RBI.
Serving legislators on RVA.
Barbara J. Cox, Plan RBA.
I'm Amanda Six. I'm the Director of Finance and Management Services for Hanover County.
Sid Kumar, Digital Media Specialist, Plan RBA.
And we have our, to my right,
Oh, hi, Martha Schickel, Plan RBA also.
thank you, everyone. And so again, this for me is just such a momentous opportunity. I want to dig right in. We have an agenda before us, and so I'm going to call upon Ms. Bircher, who will help with the review of the JLOT report, and followed by some brief discussion. We will follow does everyone have an agenda first of all? Yes? Anyone without one? Okay. Okay. Yes.
Good morning, thank you, Dr. Newbill, and I'm Kathy Bircher. I'm currently with Advanced Strategies. I shouldn't say currently, if my boss has heard me say that, they'll be upset. I'm with Advanced Strategies for the last, it's 2 years today. The previous administration, I was the Deputy Secretary of Education for the last part of the administration. This upcoming session, General Assembly, is my 17th, and I think on seniority, a lot of us out in this room outrank most members of the House and Senate, frankly, at that point. Almost all of my 17 years has been in public education policy, focused on K12, picked up K12 as we really started to see preschool come on board with K12 policies and making those adjustments in our vocabulary and acronyms as we made sure we included the 3- and 4-year-olds. So certainly we've seen an extension in early childhood, which we'll talk a little bit more about. It's not my primary wheelhouse, so I always defer to friends and neighbors in the room who know more than I do about early childhood policy, but look forward to sharing information with you all today. And I'm grateful to be here. Aside from all of my work in K12 at Advanced Strategies, one of the things that was really appealing to me as I was leaving the previous administration is that we have school board clients and local government clients. And that's where clearly my passion has laid from almost the entirety of my career. And I started as a special education teacher back in 1527 or somewhere around that time. A lot has changed in the special education world, but I hold that population of students very near and dear to my heart too. So this has been a really fortunate opportunity. And I will say, as many of you are probably in the same boat, when Dr. Newbill calls and says, hey, can you help me? You jump in and you say, of course, because just so grateful for the work that she does and that all of you do to support all of our communities here in the Central Virginia region. With that, before I get into the presentation, because I want to make sure you have all the notes, I have handouts for you, so I don't want anyone to panic over things. I have a copy, and we'll make this available electronically as well. I'll let Martha know. I have our firm's summary of an analysis of the K12 early childhood portion of the governor's budget I will hand out. I also have our analysis from July of the JLARC study on the funding formulas, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, but I'll have that for you all as well. I also have a cheat sheet In the back of the JLARC study, there's a list. It looks so short because in reality, it's a 19-page document of recommendations out of the JLARC funding formula. I have the cheat sheet for you. I try to make it easy. And then the other thing I have, which I will send electronically because Chesterfield's was super impressive. They're all impressive, but Chesterfield's was super impressive. I pulled all of the localities, your distributions, estimated distributions in the governor's biennial budget. And the caboose, so fiscal 24, 25, and 26, so you can see differences. I also linked the ones I could find, and if your locality has adopted a legislative program for their public schools and it's just not available online yet, know that that's the only reason. I was Google searching. Where I found them, I linked them in this document. So again, we'll make sure you have it electronically because that's always a good starting point to see where do you have some shared values and priorities. The other thing I added this morning, because it's important related to the JLARC study, is I do have at the top the LCI, the Local Composite Index for your communities for the 24-26 biennium. Those are updated in the lead into all of the bienniums. And interesting, my takeaway on that from a regional standpoint, we have the highs and lows in this region. We have Goochland, but they're capped at the top, 0.8, which is as high as your LCI can go, which means they are the most able to afford everything, according to the state calculation, all the way to Chesterfield, which is a 0.35 and some change, the least able. And so that's important too, when you all start talking about regional approaches to where you want to engage, or particularly on funding conversations, because the portion of state funding will really be dramatically different between a Goochland percentage, again, overall, the per pupil allotment, Goochland to Chesterfield. Chesterfield has far more students, so that number's gonna look kind of like it's more balanced, but just know that the state share is lower. So those are conversations that you all are gonna need to have. I'm gonna start circulating all of these around the room because I don't want you to feel like you have to take notes because I've got all of your handouts right here. So if that is all right, and I probably could have passed these out, and then we can go. Again, my former teacher and me would take one down. But thank you all for so much for having me. And I'm gonna go ahead, I know you're getting those and I've made the #1 teacher mistake of giving you something to look at as I start to speak, but I have found that makes my presentations more interesting. So today I want to do a brief overview, and I promise to be brief, on the JLARC K12 funding formula study and also some updates on what we see in the governor's proposed, in his introduced budget, both the caboose, although there's very little in the K12 world in the caboose budget, which is to finish out fiscal 24 through June 30th, and then into the biennial budget, and really his proposals for what he wants to see in the world of public education and early childhood as his legacy, which is this opportunity for Governor Youngkin. And to speak to the point that our chairs made around the timing of having these conversations today, I think the world has really opened up for local governments to dig into the state share of public education, the needs of our students across the public education continuum, and frankly, the needs of our families as well. Because aside from the JLARC K12 funding formula study, there have been 2 other studies that are really of interest and that JLARC has completed in the last 2 years. One was a study that they did related to the effect of the pandemic on public education and recommendations to ensure that students have what they need moving forward, and also to ensure school divisions have what they need moving forward if we face another challenge. Let's hope we never do, like the COVID pandemic. And that was heavily based on staffing. The outcomes were heavily based on staffing and mental health supports. You'll see some of that obviously in the governor's budget. So that's an important one. And the other one that was important that came out over the summer was the report on the teacher pipeline. And don't have to tell any of you who are anywhere at all related to looking at your staffing numbers in your localities, how challenging it is to have fully licensed teachers teaching the subject matter they are licensed to teach in every single one of your classrooms. And so that study is also sitting out there with a series of recommendations. So wanted to flag those 3 as well, because there's really just this layered approach that there needs to be significant change and significant funding in the K-12 space and frankly early childhood as well. So I'll mention all of those things and then we'll get rolling. So the JLARC funding study, this was a headline from a Washington Post article that came out the day after, and it really just sums up. I could actually have just made it on one slide. And I'm certain most of you saw the headlines out of the JLARC K-12 funding report. The formula is flawed and our public schools are underfunded based on a flawed formula. And the series of things that go into that, but that's really the headline. I will say it's important to note that this study was created through legislation during the 2021 session. Actually, Norfolk Public Schools had it on their legislative program that year, and Senator Linwood Lewis carried it. And those of us who have worked in the K-12 world for years knew that if we got a study to pass, it would demonstrate this outcome. We knew it'd be hard to get a study to pass because don't ask what you need to do if you aren't ready to face the consequences. And so I think that members of the General Assembly tried to kick the can down the road as often as they could, because none of them were surprised by this either. But there's the headline for you, so I wanted to mention that as well. The other two places I'll point you is both VACO and VML did really good analysis of the report. I know that you all get that information, as did the School Boards Association and Superintendents Association. So lots of places to look for information. So, and I appreciate it. I realize there's a lot on the slide. You have everything in our analysis. Some of the key findings, and no surprise, and I'm going to show you some slides in just a second. Virginia underfunds our public schools, particularly across the region of the United States and against several benchmarks of other states' national averages. Virginia is truly far behind where they should be when we look at our competition and where we stand nationally. The inputs for the standards of quality, and the standards of quality, it's one of the 3 SOs I like to say. There's standards of learning, and that's the one everyone seems to know about because we all, if you have kids, the assessments, the tests at the end of the year is something we all know about. The standards of quality seem to be the next most popular. These are in the Code of Virginia, and they establish the minimum standards that every school division has to have in place in their public schools. They are funded mainly through the staffing portions, but it's the basement level, and for local government folks, I always like to say, if there is a school that is operating just at SOQ level, parents would be banging down the doors asking for change and improvement in services, because all of our local governments fund well above, and you'll see that in just a minute, what's required by the state. And it doesn't, the higher need calculations in the SOQ formulas, again, they are staff-based, and so those staffing formulas really underserve our at-risk and high-need students, defined in this study as special education, English learners, and then at-risk students, which are students who are economically disadvantaged with the federal definition of free lunch. And so those drivers have frankly really challenged our school divisions to meet the needs of those students. Local composite index was added as part of the study in the 2022 session. Again, lots of folks wanted to look at it and everyone was afraid to look at it. And what this report found is that it's a reasonably accurate measure. Interesting, again, when you look at this part of Virginia, how different each of the localities is interesting to me. They go into great detail on how they come up with this idea of reasonably good. Again, I think particularly the city of Richmond that tends to have more of a roller coaster ride on their LCI would disagree that it's reasonably accurate, and I would assume that many of you would disagree with that assessment too. And then most states in the country do not use a staff-based funding model. They use a student-based funding model, and that was something that JLARC discussed as part of the problem. And so again, this is just a slide to demonstrate how far Virginia is from both the national average and our competing states, less per student. No surprise there. Again, there were no surprises in this. It was just almost good to finally see that there was agreement. And again, somewhere between 6 and 33% more funding needed to meet the needs of students. And that far slide, that's the staffing needs work group model. JLARC convened a very large group of educators, administrators, parents, local government folks to talk about what should be in place in our schools. As you can imagine, the folks who do the work are asking for even more than even other states and best practices by national groups who study this. So what they're saying our students need is 33% higher than what's currently funded by the state.
Are all state funding methods the same?
Are all state funding methods the same? No. They vary. Every state has a tweaked formula that's unique to its own. And some states, and referenced in the JLARC report, include Massachusetts and Maryland. Massachusetts actually faced a lawsuit to adjust their funding formulas. Interestingly, new news in Maryland. Maryland implemented a significant change to their funding formula with about a $2 billion deficit between state funding and where their report said they needed to be. And now if you're reading news out of Maryland, localities are saying, whoa, 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 we can't afford our share of this updated formula. So even when we're looking at significant improvements potentially in state funding, it's always going to be a shared responsibility. So I will put that out there. So a very long answer to your question, but important to know. And then again, this is the piece around what the state says localities need to have in place and what that cost is and what localities are actually funding. No surprise to anyone in the room. It's about $6.5 billion more localities are funding than what the state says. So again, not a single locality in the Commonwealth of Virginia is funding only the amount that the state says they have to fund. Every single one of them is over. And I used to do this really cool exercise with ping pong balls. I doubt anyone here has seen it, but you compare and contrast localities, and usually you do a high funded locality like Arlington. And if you ask Arlington, they will still say they don't have the funding they need to meet the needs of all their kids. So this is yay for Arlington, but they're still in that position. And then it's usually Carroll or Lee that are at the bottom. And then Louisa most often was in the middle for this exercise. And when you throw in the SOQ funded and the LCI, everyone's level. It's how much localities can afford to pour on top of that funding, all of the 100% locally funded components that really, that's when equity issues really come into play, because Arlington is far more able, although they will again tell you they still aren't funding what they need for their kids, to add money than Lee County or Louisa. And again, you'll see that kind of consistently across the Commonwealth. So the SOQ funding formulas, again, here's some of the issues that they found. Again, formula calculates staff types and not needs of students. They have a couple of recommendations there. One of the big ones, and one of their big findings, was that the funding for K12 is often driven by budget decisions versus school-based need decisions. Raise your hand if you're surprised. And one of those, there's a series of recession-era cuts to the budget and to the funding methodologies that still exist. One of them being the support staff cap that was implemented in 2008-09, still exists. It was the day I knew I had a little bit of, someone was listening to me because Tim Kaine said in the newspaper that Kathy Burcher is wrong. The support staff cap is not permanent. I was like, yay, he's listening to me. So that was good. But here we are in 2023. And while it's not permanent because it exists solely in budget, the unwrapping of it after all of this time has really become complicated. The General Assembly, and shout out to Senator George Barker in particular, who really led the fight on trying to unwind it as well. And there's a series of other federal funding methodologies that they implemented during the recession that also impacts local funding, state funding, and therefore local funding. All of those are still there. Pay scales, they say also a problem because they're subject to the division and the division's ability to pay those staffing shares. The prevailing practice and the use of the linear weighted average to determine the prevailing salary is a big problem. It's about the number. They have the number in their report. I want to say it's about a $10 billion hit. It's a big hit because it estimates or over adds in small school divisions, and Fairfax counts the same. Their number of teacher salaries count the same as Highland County. And so that linear weighted average that the state then supports is really drawn to smaller school divisions and generally lower salaries. And so eliminating that. And then it talks again, no system to really increasing teacher salaries or compensation. They don't go into depth on this. Important to note, whenever we talk about increasing salaries, and we have this in the governor's budget, we are only talking about those positions that are recognized in the standards of quality. Again, don't have to tell you all that. It's generally statewide about 70% of your school staff, 30% in general, it's statewide, that's kind of the average. 30% of your school staff are 100% funded through local dollars and are not SOQ required. And it doesn't mean they are positions that are unique to you. It just means that you may be choosing to implement different student-teacher ratios in many of your programs, or having more instructional assistants, bus drivers, any of those specific cafeteria and nutrition workers, like it all is dependent on what decisions are that are outside of the SOQ. But oftentimes it has to do with reducing student-teacher ratios. So again, no system there to really address compensation. Some of the big cost drivers that are not being covered inside a staffing model in particular, and I spoke about the high need students. I'm going to talk about the ELs when we get to the governor's budget because there's some interesting numbers in there. Important one in these because we have underfunded special education students, EL students. The other piece of this is the at-risk add-on, which is the only funding stream we have in the Commonwealth of Virginia that is focused 100% for divisions with high percentage of students that meet the federal definition of living in poverty, so free lunch. Those calculations are incredibly outdated. How we do that and the numbers we use are up to 7+ years old. The other piece of this, particularly over the COVID pandemic, we are seeing an increased participation in school divisions of programs that cover meals for all students. So there's no need anymore to collect free and reduced lunch information. We also know that free and reduced lunch information is far more likely to come in from the elementary level than the middle school or high school level. So we know we are counting students even using the free and reduced lunch method, but it's still a 7-year-old figure and has definitely been impacted by the good work during the pandemic, which is providing more meals for more kids. So that's an important consideration. The labor costs, Northern Virginia districts have a cost to compete adjustment, a COCA adjustment based on their cost, their additional cost of the salaries and the cost of living there. What JLARC found was, first of all, it's an old, outdated formula. It no longer takes into account significant labor cost changes everywhere else, particularly here in Central Virginia and in the Tidewater area. And so again, talking about replacing that. That for folks, I won't say this to statewide, but in this room, that will put you up for a fight because when you're fighting Northern Virginia on additional dollars and ensuring that they continue to get that and at least more is always something that you have to face. And then the small divisions really struggle for economies of scale when they look at funding per pupil and their ability to do more for more kids because they're so small. Those were just some of the cost drivers. So if you're wondering what's going to happen with this great big huge study, the General Assembly was really clever last budget that they adopted in September, it feels like. They added language that established a joint committee to look at the study. And so if I had a can, I'd kick it a little bit. So they will be putting that group together, I would assume pretty early on this session, and then they're supposed to submit a report by November 1st of 2024, which is now this year, on how to move forward. And so a little bit of a kick of the can down the road. It will be interesting to see what action the General Assembly takes to address some of these components, but also there are some things in the governor's budget. Well, there's a staffing component in the governor's budget. So it's interesting to see what the Democrats now in control, what they're willing to do around any of these funding recommendations, knowing that they're putting a work group together. I know that they are looking at funding. There's going to be legislation to start the work on shifting to a student-based formula. There's going to be legislation, if it hasn't dropped already, Carrie Pointer will have a special education bill. So there's going to be some movement. Whether or not it aligns to this study, we'll have to see.
Kathy, forgive the pop quiz, but are any of our Central Virginia delegation on the committee?
I don't believe the committee's been named yet.
Okay.
Yeah, that will be, my guess will be pretty early on in the session that they'll name those folks.
Thank you.
If anyone knows differently, feel free to shout out. So just know that a lot of things here, but we may not see a lot in the next little bit. And so speaking of, let's move on then to the governor's introduced budget that we heard on December 20th and some items that we saw here. Important to note, again, the General Assembly and the budget said we're going to get a report together in November. So we see one SOQ staffing change in the governor's introduced budget, keeping in mind JLARC didn't look at staffing standards. That's what the Board of Education does around their prescriptions. They looked at our funding formula. So they weren't saying we need more. They actually didn't even get into we need more EL teachers. They talked about how the funding methodology doesn't match the number of students. You can make the leap, but they talked about not the ratios that we need for staffing, but the funding we need. And so what you won't see in the governor's budget is anything related to this study, and you won't see anything related to the other two studies that I mentioned either, the teacher pipeline piece, although there's just a couple of incentive components and some expansion of a grant program, of a scholarship program. So there's certainly room collectively to do with the governor's budget. The big component for early childhood, the child care subsidy program, which was established with a huge federal influx of federal dollars during the pandemic, truly life-changing for families in need of child care and lifting children out of poverty. The federal funding it ran out September 30th, 2023. There's a cliff a-coming. And these families, truly, like there is data to indicate how many students have been lifted out of poverty, how many children have been lifted out of poverty because of the availability of the subsidy program. It was one of the key asks for folks who work in the early childhood space. The governor did put significant resources. You have it in your information there. I always like to, and that should be applauded. We are working to fill the cliff. The devil's always in the details, and there's still some nuance on how those dollars were implemented, where those dollars came from. First of all, it's not enough to fully fund the cliff, so we got to figure out where can we draw additional dollars to ensure that families who need the subsidy have access to it, so that they can continue in the child care programs that they're enrolled in. And then the other one is there's some shifting of money from the VPI, Virginia Preschool Initiative, during a rebenchmarking year, lowered the number, any unfilled slots were funded out to fund a portion of this child care subsidy. When you rebenchmark the numbers, you're now going to a lower watermark. And so we really have to see kind of how that plays out as we get a deeper analysis of the budget, which we'll get from the Money Committee staffs in the next few days. They're still working to figure that out. And in good news, there was some flexibility, continued language on flexibility that was important to localities, and it aligned some of the teacher requirements as well. That was language that was important. But the big thing here is going to be how we fund the child care subsidy program and ensuring that we are maintaining the funding sources for our other early childhood programs.
And I'll just add, Eva Colin, City of Richmond, and early childhood is one of the things I spend a lot of time on. And so what's interesting to note is that the bottom bullet here, aligning teacher requirements for community providers of early childhood learning, this was an effort to fully utilize and leverage all of the funds in VPI, because there is this provision that the VDOE allows local divisions to send their slots to community providers. However, historically, those community providers would have had to meet the same teacher licensing requirements as a school division, which would mean that any dollar used by VPI on a local childcare provider, those providers would need to be fully licensed. Now, in Virginia, if you're fully licensed to teach preschool, you're also fully licensed to teach up to 3rd or 5th grade, and we need those folks in K12. So we don't actually have enough licensed teachers in community providers to be able to draw down those community slots. So ironically, we're at this point where they're now right-sizing the legislative requirements to say, okay, anybody who's teaching preschool in a quality setting can be paid for with VPI, while they're reducing VPI. So it's almost, we were trying to solve for the fact that we were under leveraging VPI with still tremendous need in our communities. So we fixed one part while the total fund availability has been reduced. And so that raises a lot of questions, particularly because if you've been following the state ECCE, Early Childhood Care and Education Commission, which has been reporting over the past year, indicated a much more significant gap than what the administration is now naming as the gap. So there's just a lot of questions to Kathy's point. But I just wanted to name that alignment was a big win, but now it comes with a question like, is there enough money to actually, achieve what the goals were for that realignment?
And I think the big picture is, one, there's, like K through 12, there's more need for money in the early childhood space, but then there's also, these programs are newish in Virginia, so there's more need to improve the program so that not only preschools associated with our school systems benefit, but we have at-home daycares that are high quality, we have community centers that are high quality, and then we also have centers that maybe we're all nervous about. So continuing to improve the programmatic language of all of those various early childhood education so that we make sure our kids enter kindergarten prepared. Is ongoing efforts that Richmond's always happy to talk about and has been working hard on in the city.
Yeah, Hyper specifically, the subsidy dollars obviously are administered through departments of social services, but there was no attendant infrastructure investment to say, if you're going to dramatically increase the availability of subsidy, how do you ensure local DSSs can actually get that money out the door? And so that didn't happen. So we didn't see the utilization rate pace with the available funding, and so they're almost right-sizing funding with an assumption that the current utilization will stay stable.
Lots going on in the early childhood space. And again, this continuum of public education starting truly at birth and making sure we're meeting the needs of our families.
And
Do you have any, and you may not have any further details, but when I was looking at the budget language, it specifically talked about that they were going to waive the LCI match for the VPI program because I think it was the 2020 to 2022 biennium when there was the first push for early childhood education. There was a ton of money added into early childhood education, but every single year, there was a ton of money left on the table. And so they were throwing money into it knowing there was an unmet need, but every year localities couldn't draw it down. So hopefully with some of these initiatives and changing it, people will be able to access the money. And then hopefully, to your point, with being able to better align money into quality centers, into in the community. I also serve on a nonprofit preschool in my locality and trying to look at the wages of those people, but affordability for parents to be able to get to maintain access of those preschools, like that's a huge issue. And so being able to keep those people on staff, but then for parents to be able to afford for their children to go to preschool, and how does all of this, because it is an accredited and licensed, and there's some new licensing and curriculum requirements that are very difficult for a non-licensed teacher in a preschool or a daycare setting to try to work through. So that whole continuum of care in a non-school setting will be very interesting. But it really will help our localities in terms of funding, because we're getting a lot of pressure on the county side to add new things for our schools. So how can we, look at the whole child will be very interesting once we get the full set of language on that.
And there is language, two things, there's language that eliminates the LCI cap on the early child, or the Virginia Preschool Initiative. And the other thing, there's language in the budget as well to study how well did the compensation payments that were made to early childhood care providers actually do for keeping them in that workforce. So there's a study that will, assuming that language remains, and that seems reasonable. Certainly that's a study, that's something we haven't looked at, that language is also in the budget.
Kathy, just to clarify, because I think I'm hearing, I want to make, just to be clear, when we say eliminate the LCI cap, we mean for the locality, not the state. The
correct.
State's not going to pay more than $4,179.50
Yes, the cap for the localities.
So it's not like we're accessing more money from the state, it just means the locality can give more than that 50%.
Yep.
Which is, thank you,
Which-
thank you for that opportunity.
And it results in a savings for the state.
Yeah, it's major savings for the state, it might leave more money on the table for the state. Yeah.
Oh, well, we were already doing that.
Exactly. Like in Richmond, I think we're over almost, I think we're spending probably 100% over.
Yeah, and you'll see in my budget analysis, the amount of state savings related to eliminating the cap on the LCI for preschool. Into the K-12 space, a couple of important components I wanted to flag for you all, and I'm gonna get to this. Some of these are the governor's key priorities, and obviously the governor ran on and was elected on tax reform, and he announced in his budget massive changes to income tax in Virginia, also sales tax, expanding what we tax through sales tax in the Commonwealth. There are implications though. If you recall, I think it's now 2 sessions ago, when the sales tax on groceries and hygiene products were eliminated, there's actually language in the Code of Virginia, and those of us in the K-12 space worked really hard to get that language in the code, that it created a supplemental payment from the state to offset that loss. Reason for that is that tax revenue came back, and that took off of the top, the total cost of K-12, which then decreases the locality's portion. And so having that funding is important to decrease the overall cost so that your share is less. Those supplemental payments are in the code. What the governor proposes is eliminating those supplemental payments. That's about a $229 million reduction in K-12 over the biennium. And actually, the budget also has legislative action to eliminate that, to change that section of the law. So, they did it in the budget, but they also are clearly through the budget, going after legislative action to make that change permanent. However, they talked about the expanded sales tax for these digital platforms and these other services. That portion of sales tax is the offset. However, when you dig into the budget, the offset is only about $84 million over the biennium estimated. And so a $229 million reduction and an $84 million offset estimated is a real hit to public schools and to localities. Because again, those sales tax dollars take the total price tag down, which then brings down your local share of the SOQ mandated. So wanted to mention that as an important component, and certainly something that, you know, all of us who work in local government and with local school divisions have been flagging for both the money committee and their staffs to make sure that they're pointing out. Compensation, again, SOQ funded positions only, a 1% bonus in fiscal '25. Keeping in mind, bonuses don't play into VRS or retirement at all for teachers and SOQ funded positions. I want to flag that. That's about $53 million. And then a full 2% salary adjustment in fiscal '26 for the full year, and that's about $122 million, assuming the staffing standards stay the same. The governor does propose increasing our reading specialist ratios in the SOQs to match the implementation of the Literacy Act. So it will put reading specialists in place through middle school, which the Literacy Act, which the extension of it passed last session, that, I don't have that number right in front of me. You've got it in your, I don't want to guess, but I think it's $33 million. If I'm guessing right, that's so sad for me. If I'm guessing wrong, you have the number right in front of you. The two components that were big announcements for the governor, and obviously the first one in particular we've been hearing a lot about, the lab schools that he's been working on, putting in place some reliable funding. There was a one-time influx in the previous biennium. He has put $30 million in each year to have more reliable funding for the establishment and running of our lab schools here in Virginia. And then the Diploma Plus program is around industry, ensuring that students can earn an industry credential while they are in high school. And I think, again, that's been something that every locality in the Commonwealth has been looking at. And frankly, years ago, the General Assembly put in place the requirement to earn an industry credential for many of those programs, which then drove the cost way up for a lot of school divisions, which then forced some of those industry credential programs to move aside and not be in our high schools. But what this does, when you dig into the budget, it's a fund that the student/parent would access. It would go into a digital wallet, and then they could then go and take the courses or whatever materials and supplies they need to be able to pay for and earn their industry credential. So it is $40 million over the biennium, but it's in payments established through digital wallets for families to then offset. So this is not additional money for K12, incredibly helpful for students who need to earn that industry credential, but that is not an influx of cash into the K12 schools. It is a K12 program, so it's part of the number that the governor is talking about. And then mental health support as well. The governor proposes establishing at the Department of Education an officer of mental health to really focus on this work in our schools. And again, if you get the chance to read the JLARC study on the impact of the pandemic, and just talk to anyone who works anywhere in your schools, they can tell you about the increased challenges of mental health in our schools. And also, he invests about $14.5 million in it's actually 6 through 12 telehealth. And it would a state contract to provide telemental health for students 6 through 12. So we do see some investments there. The other items that I wanted to point out that are important, a new state assessment is proposed. That's been in the works and something they're looking at. That's about $40 million over the biennium to figure out a new way to look at how we assess and measure student performance. VRS payments, $350 million for the unfunded liability, which was a good move. I will tell you that 2 payments, and again, it's kind of shifting of money out of different components and places. So we'll have to pay attention to the deeper dive on exactly how that funding may, the implications it may have for your local budgets, particularly around any funding into the unfunded liability. The School Construction Assistance Fund, again, something, we saw a $25 billion price tag when the School Construction and Modernization Commission finished their report. $160 million into the Assistance Fund. Interestingly, that's casino money. So if you're curious about whether or not there's going to be a battle for what casino, it's kind of like the lottery revenues come to K12. I would anticipate some discussion, we'll say, around how we utilize casino revenues moving forward. The governor applies them to school construction. Significant increase, I separate in increase.
Governor Northam had signed legislation that directed the casino revenues into the school construction program, so that's in code now.
Okay, good, thanks,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that catch. I was thinking it was early childhood, but I'm losing my mind. Yeah. Okay, so thank you. So it's already there. Thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I apologize for increase being separated. CTE counts for students way up. This is a $26 million increase in CTE, which is a really big number. So I'll be curious to see what those student counts look like when we get the more detailed distribution sheets. Interesting language under the Secretary of Education to develop a report on teacher compensation, including how teacher compensation is tied to student performance. So they'll be doing a study there, assuming that language remains. This next bullet, a significant reduction in EL funding, and that's a student count reduction. So that was a technical reduction over the biennium of $10 million because this state is reporting a reduction in EL students. That is so contrary to everything I have heard out in the field, everything that the Board of Education has heard. And so this is one that we are flagging as well for Money Committee staffs, again, needing to see the specific student counts. But that was one, when I saw it, my eyebrows went up because it doesn't match anything we're hearing. So it'll be interesting to see how those counts. And keeping in mind, student counts are related to how much staff you have in place because we have a staffing model here in Virginia. And the other thing that was of interest to me, reduced summer school funding based on what they project the number of students participating will be. It's about a $3.5 million reduction in summer school. Again, a little bit contrary to what we've been hearing and seeing around need for summer school. And some of it's related wholly to the pandemic and not being able to staff summer school slots. So kind of that whole idea of like, oh, some of it's come down, maybe this is where we are, this is where we're projecting. And the other piece is that I do know that some grant requests for this funding were also denied. And so there was leftover money, you could say.
I was gonna add that with the summer school, just to really name, given the priorities of the administration around pandemic recovery, of the 4 strategies that have been promoted as solving pandemic learning loss, summer school is at the top.
Right.
And so the idea of reducing summer school based on projected enrollment without trying to figure out how to incentivize both staffing for that and participation at the student side, as well as how that ties into student mental health, it does seem disjointed. It seems like almost an oversight in the budget because it is so integral to multiple priorities named by this administration.
And I think those last 2 budgets, there's certain funding that is on like a lag old data. And so those 2 numbers are gonna be pulled off of like a 2020 data, and you saw a disproportion of certain populations of students who may be unenrolled or changed their learning style or who didn't participate in funding or in summer school or certain types of learning. So it would be interesting to see maybe what localities reported in their annual school report for that time period, because it seems like it's a data integrity issue that has driven those 2 things specifically. In our locality, in particular, our EL numbers have grown astronomically. So to me, it points to a data integrity issue because those 2 are formula based on a lag. And so I just don't know that maybe that the Department of Education, especially with the significant turnover that they've had, have advised properly in the development of the budget that's probably a significant data error that's going to impact localities. So from a legislative standpoint, to me as a data person, and I did school budgets previously, that's just jumps out to me as a data error.
Yep. And again, jumped off the page a little bit, but agree. Again, these are technical updates based on actual projections or projections based on data that they've pulled. And again, under general practice, it's older data and we know that. But at the same time, it doesn't match where we know we likely have needs in our school division. So again, technical updates don't always keep pace with what's actually happening in our schools. And anyone who does a school budget, bless your heart. Yes. This is the last little bit I wanted to share, and this is the re-benchmarking puzzle. And re-benchmarking is not something that's fun to describe to people, so here I go. Every 2 years, the cost of the SOQ programs are updated, and there's technical updates, there's projections on number of kids, and it always goes up, generally, it almost always goes up. During the pandemic, it didn't, but that's separate. And there's usually an increase also related with policy decisions, like changes in salary. We had 10% salary adjustments in the last biennium, and so big numbers, and those are continuing costs. So what re-benchmarking does is it updates the cost of the programs currently in existence for K12. To do nothing different, what will it cost in the next biennium? And we need to make sure we are covering that cost and paying that bill as a state, as a Commonwealth. And so where things have gone a little awry is because the budget was adopted in September, which is when fiscal 24 had already started, or 24 had already started, the budget that the governor has takes some funding that was in that budget for fiscal 24 and extends it across the biennium. It's one-time funding though. And that's the difference you see here. And this was created for me by a friend over Money Committee staff. So typically your base budget, you pull out all of your one-time funding. That's where you start. And this is where that should be. So the one-time spending of $615.8 million. So the House appropriations, like this is our cost. This is what we're spending right now. We're going to put that over here. The cost to continue to do that is now this much. They've pulled the one-time funding out. So that's the estimate of their cost. $688.4 million in year one, $703.7 million in year two. What DPB and the department submitted was because of when that budget was adopted, the base budget is elevated by that one-time dollar. And so they don't need to pull it out because it was in the 24 budget. And so they're not pulling it out of the base, they're leaving it in there. And so re-benchmarking in the governor's budget is $72.6 million in year one and $87.9 million in year two. However, you do see in the documents I gave you, that $615.8 million is reflected in the biennial budget for 2 years. And so part of the struggle right now the Money Committee staffs are having is figuring out how did they do that? Because right now, the governor's office is saying the cost of re-benchmarking is, I was a history major, so 72 plus 87, $160-ish million. And the Money Committee staffs are saying it's somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 billion. That's a significant difference. And so that's something that they're gonna have to work out because that difference, the 1.1 to 1.3 billion dollars, the governor has spent on other priorities. And so including tax cuts. And so that's going to be part of figuring this out is what is the implication of those one-time dollars that were in the budget that they adopted in September? And how does that impact or affect the cost of re-benchmarking? For local governments, it's not very exciting to listen to talks about re-benchmarking, but the difference between the state funding 160 million or 1.3 billion in the change just to keep your programs running is a pretty big deal.
And Kathy,
So we're learning more about this every day.
I'm also a liberal arts major, so I just want to make sure I understand. Re-benchmarking is essentially inflation and taking in new data to keep paying for what we're currently doing.
Correct.
And there's like ginormous.
$1 billion.
Ginormous is the
Liberal
accurate
arts
term.
translation.
Ginormous.
Ginormous difference between what the General Assembly's Money Committee staff experts think and what the governor's budget staff thinks needs to happen to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, and
Thanks for
the
slowing
House,
down.
this is House Appropriations. As soon as I saw the re-benchmarking numbers, one of my first calls was to my friend who does K12 for House Appropriations, and I was like, what on earth? And we worked through it, and he created the slides, like, this is your slide, Kathy. He shared it since with the committee, which is great, but it was super helpful for me to kind of figure it out. But what's interesting is that you can see that $615 million across both years of the biennium. Again, the assumption in the introduced budget is that it was applied in fiscal 24 and carries across to 26. So that's something they're gonna have to work out. Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee have a slightly different number. It's closer to the House, but so it's still very high, but it's not exactly, it's not exactly $1.3 billion like the House has. So this is gonna be a top priority for Money Committee staff to figure out. I would anticipate in the first couple of days, we will see staff presentations on the governor's introduced budget. That always happens, and so that will be one to watch, and certainly one to make sure you're getting information on what they say that bill will be. Because again, when we're looking at the JLARC funding study, the teacher pipeline study, the impact of the pandemic study and all the things that we know we need, if you have an unexpected bill of $1.1 billion, it's tough to make big investments in those other programs. And that's what they're likely going to have to wrestle with if, in fact, the House Appropriations Committee current estimate, and frankly, the Senate Finance and Appropriations estimate is closer to where they really need to be. So keep an eye on that.
Just one thing to keep in back of mind, I'm just realizing as I'm looking at this, because as I was turned to Matthew, and I was just like, oh, this is scarier than like seeing it on the graph is scarier, the chart is scarier than just conceiving it in my brain. Also in the backdrop is a lot of our school divisions have been using one-time relief dollars on things that the localities will desire to be recurring, and that's not reflected in this either. And so I think that's just something else to consider at the local level is, where have pandemic era relief dollars from the various tranches of ESSER been invested into programs and initiatives that we actually want to continue, and that is not reflected in any state funding source nor any state funding proposal, because that would compound that bill that we get if this is the significance of re-benchmarking.
The other thing we saw in re-benchmarking that we always see, but it was significantly larger related to the federal dollars, was the federal deduct amount, that's again, it's money that the state, it's in the K12 budgets, but it's federal dollars. So when the Commonwealth evaluates how much do we owe for the price of K12, they deduct the federal dollars. And generally there are special ed programs, Title I programs, and the number is pretty consistent. The number for the federal deduct this year was massive because they deducted all of the spent federal dollars out, because all of that money was in our K-12 budgets in the Commonwealth, because they ran through your local budgets, the ESSER dollars, or they ran through the agency. So the federal deduct is enormous. I will flag for you, because this came to me when I was listening to the House Appropriations Committee, we will see the same thing in the 26-28 biennium, because the spend down of those federal dollars runs through September of 2025. So we will see another big federal deduct next year, and even to your point, the implication of programs we're running in this federal dollars, especially when that funding, the cliff, happens. So if I were you, I would focus on a few things. Obviously, state spending is going to be a big deal. And we're going to have really big differences, I would anticipate, in the budgets that come out of the House and the Senate versus what we see in from the governor's budget. Both are predicting a mild recession through fiscal 25 into the beginning of 26, if I remember correctly. And so conservative spending is something that we're going to see, and without question. However, figuring out this problem for K-12, the re-benchmarking problem that I'm pointing to for folks, all of the folks who I'm sure are watching online from this exciting presentation on re-benchmarking, that's going to be a big deal when it comes to ultimately how much additional dollars they have to spend. So that would be one I would without question track. I'd be paying attention to who is named to that joint committee to review the JLARC study on K-12 funding. And again, looking at the specific needs of your kids, particularly EL learners, making sure we're getting those counts, and thinking about your summer school programs too, just from this presentation. Obviously, you all have a lot from a regional standpoint that I hope you can coalesce around. I think from the state perspective, there's a lot that the local governments have to coalesce around in this budget as well. But I'm always available for questions. Dr. Newbill, like I said, she says, can you help with, and doesn't matter what the rest of the Senate says, I'm always there to help her out. And so anything that I can do to be helpful, I'm happy to do. I will send these documents, Martha, to you so that you can post them, and that the links to legislative programs that I have will be live as well.
Thank you.
And with that, I will step down and leave the re-benchmarking slide up.
It's still here. Kathy, thank you, number one. This is great information. I think that out of those reviews, there were some areas of common interest. We thought that might be a beginning of conversation, and I'm not sure if there is a.
Martha has a copy of that.
Martha, you have that?
That supplemental sheet that showed the areas of common interest.
So after we've heard.
Yes, it's on the next slide.
Okay, thank you. Because now that we have, and I know that was lots. Oh, good question. Any questions for Kathy?
Just making sure.
Okay.
Too many.
And so who's, are you pointing?
I can walk through this.
Yeah, I didn't know which. Didn't want to take
So
anybody, so.
we just brainstormed a little yesterday to try and figure out what are some areas that are truly across the board, everybody agrees with. And the first one is the most obvious, which is an increase in state funding across the board for education helps all of us. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. The second one Kathy alluded to, but when the governor talked about, or in the governor's budget, the loss of the supplemental grocery tax, when the state gave a break on grocery tax, that money went to local governments for schools. And so when they did away with that grocery tax for education, we lost that money. So we'd like that restored. And Kathy or anybody, feel free to jump in if I say anything wrong. The third area was just in general, the need for more funding for at-risk youth. And while we have different numbers in our various localities of at-risk youth and different percentage of at-risk population, we all struggle with at-risk funding. And anything that increases the pie increases all of our shares for at-risk funding, regardless of the formula that's used and how you benefit from the particular formula. The fourth one was just overall, and I think you heard it from the questions and discussion today, the growing importance of early childhood care and education and how that helps our K12 system. It helps everything, but it specifically helps our K12 system, even though it's not technically part of the K12 system. So anything that helps that and helps us direct money to places where it can actually get spent and not sit being unused, those are all good things. And then the last one we came up with was a consistent source of revenue and hopefully a growing source of revenue for school construction, where the state has always in the past claimed that school construction was a totally local function. And it used to be that the local governments paid 100% of school construction. So the state pays some now, but getting a consistent amount and not having to wonder every year how much money would be out there for school construction, which again, all of us have school construction or rehab needs for our growingly old school buildings and the new school facilities for growing localities. So those are the ones we came up with, and we think there shouldn't be a whole lot of disagreement about the importance of these issues.
I think Dr. Newell and I talked about it, and I don't think there's a disagreement at all as to the need, but I think if we, they're all elephants. And I think that if we try to focus on all of them, we'll focus on none of them. And because of that, I think that my recommendation would be that we focus first on the JLARC study, which is the most recent, and we can all significantly benefit from proper funding there. And if we're successful, hopefully, it might take us a little while because nothing, I think, was it Andreas? Somebody in a meeting yesterday said that we work at a glacier's pace. And I think that, unfortunately, that's true, as, on the local and the state level. I think the local level actually functions a little faster than the state, which functions a little faster than the federal government, but we're all slower than the needs that exist. So my recommendation would be that we focus, and I think we need to start as soon as they name this joint group to be studying the JLARC study. I think we need to have somebody that's willing to be in the, as much around that group as we can, and making sure they know that we're there. And we need to, in the meantime, work together to do a resolution between all of the Plan RVA jurisdictions. I think we have, if I counted right, we have at least 7 of the 9 here today. being represented, which shows that this is important to all of us, that we work together. Maybe we get something that Plan RVA helps to put together that each of our jurisdictions can sign on to, and we submit it in a way that shows that we're united on this front. And I don't know if anybody else has a different recommendation, but that would be my recommendation.
I have a question around who is going to be taking the responsibility of placing or deciding who is going to be on that committee. Kind of picking up on what Megan was saying, in that I'm not sure who's making that decision.
It's the chairs of the two money committees, so the chair of House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriation.
So there are targets.
Probably, kind of yes, but more of waiting to see who they appoint. Because they'll try to do a geographical representation. And neither of those chairmen are from the Richmond area, one's from Hampton Roads and one's from Northern Virginia. So I'm not sure our voices would be that useful to them at this point. But it's very likely that each of the bodies will, and Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong on my political analysis, but I think that both the Senate and the House will have somebody from the Richmond area. Each side will, because we're too big a part of the state.
I think that we can likely predict that Senator Hashmi will be serving on this subcommittee or this working group. She will be chair of Senate Education and Health, and I think will be on Senate Finance.
And Carrie Corner will probably end up being on the group in this.
And their ties with Chesterfield is very close. She lived in my district.
Great.
So they're the people that we need to be focusing on so that they recognize the.
But we can't just focus on a small target. I mean, we really have to focus on everybody that represents every one of our, if they represent even a fifth of your district, of your jurisdiction, we need to be targeting all of them. We need to be doing it together with one voice. If we don't, we're gonna get drowned out. And honestly, we're gonna get drowned out this first year anyways. But if we start making noise now and we continue to make the noise, then maybe 64 will get wide. I mean, that's how it works.
So it would be helpful for me if I wanted, make sure that everyone's on board with what's being recommended as our focus.
I just, one clarifying question. There are many recommendations within the J-Lab study.
Yes.
And that's where I think in our early conversations,
yes.
Suzette reminded me, I am a idealist, I try to be pragmatic, but she was like, it's a re-benchmarking year, Eva, like, that's gonna be number one, but I think to your point, Mr. Engel, like, talking about it now means longer term, we get that attention after we get past the re-benchmarking piece. However, I do wonder if it's worth prioritizing within those recommendations, since there are so many that it could be easy just to set it aside if it's conflicting. I'm just wondering.
Well, I think it's gonna be important because there are near-term and long-term recommendations nested within each of those things. And so I don't do the whole universe, it's very specific. That's why I'm wanting to make sure of where we are across the regions in this.
Ms. Newbill?
Okay.
Ms. Newbill?
Yes.
Shawn Davis?
Hi,
Good
Shawn.
morning.
Okay.
Good morning. Happy
Good to
New
hear
Year
you.
also. So, yeah, the point I just wanted to make was really just to reemphasize what Dr. Newbill was saying. There's going to be, as a regional commission, there's going to be nuances in each locality that are going to be different. So, something that's going to take place in Goochland may have more of an impact there than it would Richmond, and there may be more impacts in Goochland or in Richmond than Goochland, just as an example. But as a facilitator, we're Plan RVA because we are one of the strong regional bodies and obviously don't have a legislative agenda on education. We do want to be a facilitator for these kinds of meetings. And I just want to add in that as folks go back to their localities after meetings like this and work on their individual legislative agendas, it may be important that if the region does want to come together and have some type of positional statement, to make sure you get with your VACO individuals, your VML folks, who can actually put a legislative agenda together with endorsements from the individual localities as it pertains to education. And we're certainly so glad to host this and facilitate and bring folks together. But I think it's been mentioned a number of times, and I just want to bolster that because of all the differences and the nuances, as particularly as it pertains to education, uh, this is important that whatever's taken from this meeting goes back to the locality so they can draft their individual legislative agendas and put them through. But if you want more weight and power, because we can't do a legislative agenda on education, obviously at Plan RVA, but if you want more weight and power and bring a lot of those people in to really emphasize what Dr. Newbill says, it's important to reach out to your VACO and your VML folks. With that, I sit on the VACO board, and I'm not sure who actually sits on the VML board, but if we need some help facilitating the actual drafting of localities coming together for a legislative agenda, let me know, and I'll work in Region 3. I can work to help push that through and get it to VACO, and I'm happy to do that. So I just wanted to add that in as folks move forward, and I know the meeting's getting ready to end. So thank you all.
Thank you, Sean. That is.
Yes, ma'am.
That's great.
Should we have them, maybe each of the, I asked this because I'm also on the Crater PDC, and Chesterfield's the only one that actually has somebody that, goes to the delegation, meets with VACO, and also, goes down to the state and lobbies on behalf of the jurisdiction. The rest of the jurisdictions in the Crater PDC do not have somebody to do that for them. Do all of our jurisdiction members have somebody in place to work on legislation like that for them?
Yes. The three large ones.
Well, I know the three large ones do, but we've got we're 9 strong here, and I'm asking if all of us have that capacity.
Yeah, for Powhatan, it's just other duties is assigned amongst many other things, but we don't have anybody who specializes in that or dedicates their time to it.
And Gucci does.
You do? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Because I think that might be a good next step, would be to try to get somebody from each of the 9 localities that, because most of us probably have some kind of legislative package for the most part that we've already worked on, because if we haven't, then to be honest with you, this meeting's behind. But the JLARC study is relatively recent in releasing the findings that we could really get together like this. Do we try to put them together and see if they can come up with a common interest from all of our packages and tighten that together?
Mr. Ingram, Mike Sherman with Henrico County. Kudos to everybody here. I think there's been a lot of really good information. I think you and Dr. Newbill have brought together a kind of a foundation that's kind of been there a lot, but you don't necessarily hear outside. And that is that, my experience down at the Capitol is that we have worked together really well over many years. And to Mr. Davis's point, we're all members of VML and or VACO.
No, we're not.
I'm sorry.
Except one.
I apologize. The director of VACO says all counties, and then there's the asterisk. My apologies. I think it's great that we move forward together. I just want to make sure we do it in a way that is kind of consistent and not kind of a one-off, so that it's not perceived by folks outside as something amiss or afoot.
And
Absolutely.
to
Well, I mean, I think,
emphasize something that many people have said, it's really late for this session. Except to the degree all of our localities have already adopted agendas, which I'm sure we could do a Venn diagram of all 9, and there would be a pretty big overlap in the middle, and probably as simple as the first bullet point. We all need more money from the state. But as we move ahead to next year to figure out how this group can supplement the work VML and VACO are doing, also all of the education groups. I'm not the right person to name the various education groups, but they've done a heck of a lot of work that we don't need to recreate. And so thinking about, what are we doing in the next 2 months, but also what are we doing ahead of November when the committee will be making its recommendation to make sure we're heard, and ahead of the governor's budget development for next year and ahead of the General Assembly, I think are probably two different tracks. This session may have to look a little more ad hoc, and maybe we're all just talking more and, continuing to build on what's happening here and what already exists versus laying out something a little more formal for next year, but.
And you're going back to Mr. Miller's earlier point, which is the big target is the people who are sitting on that committee, because they'll be making the recommendations for the following years that's when it makes the difference.
They're gonna make the recommendation in November, and that's where we really need to be focusing right now, is my thought, is what they're gonna recommend in November.
They'll really get to work once session's done. They'll be too busy while session's here, so they'll have ears for the November report in April and over the summer, and making sure, we've got an amazing amount of expertise in this room. I'm looking at the folks I know who do intergov for Chesterfield and Enrico, and Kathy and Suzette are both former deputy secretaries of education, and making sure we use those quieter months to make sure that, the power of the pen is taken by some of our folks, and that they're analyzing the most up-to-date data and et cetera. So to some degree, there's a little relief for the November report. We don't have to do it now. That'll pick up once session's done. But in terms of making sure the right rebenchmarking is set, in terms of figuring out, are we getting our supplemental grocery tax, how we're advocating to make sure localities come out at least as good as we are now versus, hopefully even a little better. That's the more urgent moment, in my opinion.
I would kind of like to echo that if I could. I do like the idea of kind of looking at the committee as it meets, collectively working together, monitoring that, working with those folks along the way, and really kind of targeting for the following year. What they're gonna do is a Herculean effort, and it's gonna take time. And I think most of the folks that are gonna be officially appointed to that already know and have already started some kind of conversations about what they're looking forward to. Being a part of those kind of conversations as we move forward and being able to focus on the priorities that are gonna happen during this upcoming session are gonna be really important. And to your point, yes, we need to start having those conversations, but it's gonna be a little bit before we have that opportunity to do so with credibility.
Other comments? Guess I'm looking for both hands. Yes, we have a lot of planning to do so that next year this time we're fully we have our like that. But so that definitely it's a parallel conversation we can get going. At the same time, in this moment, we still have an opportunity, to your point, the monitoring, but what is it that we're wanting to embrace when we're going over, making sure, are they doing this relative to any one of those items or another item, the J-Law? What is it that we are wanting to make sure that we are advocating for, even in this time frame? So I guess I don't see it as either or. It is short order. We'll all admit that, yeah. But is there an opportunity to embrace a component and to then go over and be monitoring with those folks who are on that and advocating? Yes.
Just to
Well,
clarify.
Dr. Newbill, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Sean Davis. We have thank you, sir. So, yeah, I think it's a great question. Let's not forget that we have our local technical assistance program through Plan RVA, and while obviously the lion's share of that is on things like planning and land use and transportation and all of those types of things, I still think Plan RVA can be a resource to some of the localities that need help to facilitate information dissemination and all of those types of things, because some of the things that are going to touch on the region are going to affect all of our 9 localities. So we've still got that resource available. And again, I think we can be the forum where folks want to come in and we can facilitate. I just want to, and I don't know if this came up earlier or not, because I logged on a little late. What my concern would be is anything that came out that, because there are going to be so many different specific needs, i.e. Hanover's looking at capital improvements where maybe another place isn't looking at the capital improvements this year. All of a sudden we throw something in there that's specific to Hanover, and Ashland says, yeah, that's great, but New Kent says it's not. I would just caution that we need to be careful on that. I kind of see our role as a facilitator, but I don't want it to be lost that VACO and VML, again, I sit on the board there, and I don't say that for any other reason than to say that it is important, particularly as regions come together, that can help bring a package to some of those larger organizations. So I'm not quite sure I understand where maybe some folks want to go. I just want to, again, I guess, reiterate the point that we've got an opportunity here to facilitate on anything any of the commissioners want to talk about. I just don't know how we get into a positional statement, like you said, this early on in short order. And I don't know if that's something that's up for discussion. I know we're not going to make that decision today, but I don't know how we get into a positional statement here with so many localities having so much diversity in their funding needs. Is that something somebody wants to kind of bat around the table? Obviously, I'm remote, but I think that could be problematic.
Well, so for me, the very first item, if without having to do deep dive, support for increase in state funding for public education across the Commonwealth seems like something we could all embrace, I think. But it could be any of those. It could be something in addition. I think to your point, Sean, once we start getting very jurisdiction specific, then that's a challenge. But when it's at that broader level, that that would be beneficial for all of us, or any of the other categories, or ones that are not there, but it's that level.
Dr. Newbo, quick question. When you say we, who is the we when you say that? Is it Plan RVA?
No.
Is it?
The we would be the regional, our region coming together with a single voice around whatever the item is. That's the way for me.
I'm on the same page with Mr. Engel in that we need to make sure we've identified the problem. And what we agree on is the JLARC has identified the problem. And that is that the schools are severely they're just underfunded at such a rate that it is impacting our students primarily, meaning that they are not getting the resources they need to what is the initial mission of the schools, which is to teach and to be able to think about critical thinking and making sure that they're growing up healthy and mental health and all these kind of things. So focusing back on the JLARC study gives us a union to say we need to follow through on the recommendations that the JLARC study have put forth. And so that seems like to me, and Mr. Engel mentioned to me earlier today, is at least we can say, okay, that's a big bite to chew. I mean, that's gonna be a big bite. So let's go ahead and say, let's get on the path to funding what the JLARC study is. And let's at least put that together so over the next 5 years, when we wake up 5 years from now, we have followed through on what the JLARC study was intending in the first place.
So for me, to your point, I think most of the items in the JLARC study bespeak additional support for funding around public education. So there are near-term and long-term items there.
Exactly.
We'd have to be really specific in terms, are we talking all of them in this moment, or do some rise to the top more at this moment than others that we would really advocate for? I mean, there still would be work. I mean, that's nested under there for me. So it isn't an aside.
Dr. Nabil, 100%. And that's not my issue. I don't know of anybody in here that doesn't already have embedded in their legislative policy or the board's position that education is a giant priority. If not the top priority in a locality based on just budgeting. I think what I think I heard was Mr. Davis's point is we all agree there. And we've already said that universally. The question then starts as you trickle down, once we get past that and we start seeing actual dollars as policy and budgets or language in bills that start impacting us differently. I have a giant concern because this body has been here before and it was on transportation. And it started with this high level, we want more transportation dollars. Well, what happens when, you're on the board, y'all are on boards and councils. The General Assembly is no different and not facing any different decisions that y'all have to do, and that is the allocation of scarce resources. Each of the individual kind of territories are all fighting for 100% of that budget, make no mistake about it. You deal with that in your capacities, they deal with it in their capacities. In a prior iteration of this body, as they got involved in transportation funding, bad things happened because we came together as a region and said, hey, yes, transportation is great. And this body sent somebody down to the General Assembly that started talking on behalf of every single one of y'all collectively. But the nuances all of a sudden started creating divisions inside of this body.
Interesting.
And what happened is you start sending mixed messages down there. And that undercuts all of our credibilities for everything else that we do. At what point, when we say we want 100% of the recommendations in JLARC and all the money goes along with it, except they take transportation from Hanover or Goochland, or they take 599 funding, or they take something from the city, and now we're scrapping with each other in a public forum, and I don't think that's healthy. We're already having these conversations and we'll continue to have these conversations. I love the idea of coming together and as a region in a more formal capacity. I think there's already a regional group that's been it's been in existence and it kind of went away and is coming back again. This is a great step in that direction. I have no qualms whatsoever in saying, hey, let's talk about the things that matter to us that are collective and let's work together. We just need to do it in a smart way that doesn't adversely impact our other efforts, as they're all gonna be important to us.
So can I ask a follow-up question? So Mike, given all of that, what is it you think this group can do as a takeaway?
I like the idea of facilitating us getting together. I like the idea of focusing on the study committee that the General Assembly is gonna have, and let's just keep the conversation moving forward. And agree that, hey, let's figure out where we can all hold hands and move forward. But when you start defining things right now, we started with an amazing presentation, and Kathy, thank you, that in Chesterfield, that was a lot of work, and I think it was quite instructional. But I think Kathy and Matt and Natalie and Suzette will tell you that when we started getting into the governor's budget, that's a starting document. Kathy had it right out of the gate when she called it a proposed budget. There's a saying at the Capitol that the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. It's a negotiation that already started months ago with the governor looking at what his priorities are, looking at a General Assembly that now has a different makeup than it did just last year. And even within the General Assembly, you're gonna have a dynamic between the House and the Senate. We are so early in this process, and now we're talking about education funding in this committee that is gonna be at least a year out. That's their first step. That's not the end. fixing the problems with education has been look, I've been walking around those halls since 1995, and it's been a problem then. It probably predates, that time period by decades and decades. This is great. Please don't mistake what I'm saying. To the extent that in a public capacity, we as a region hold hands the way we did on CVTA or any of these other things is only beneficial. You just have to make sure that as we move forward, we're not tossing out landmines in the future that are gonna bite us in the end. And that's all I'm saying, Suzette. Let's hold hands, let's continue to work together, whether it's in this capacity as a part of VML and VACO or holding hands in just a more informal capacity, because we all share this need. It's so incredibly frustrating when on the one hand, the state says, oh, hey, for purposes of your balance sheet, teacher pensions are a local liability. But then in the same session, out of a different side of their mouth, say, we're gonna give teachers raises. And oh, by the way, it's only those SOQ teachers, and it's only our percentage of it. It's
Yeah, correct. I'm sorry, Mike, I don't mean to interrupt, but that's a huge point. I say I'm sorry that I interrupt, but
No,
yeah,
please.
it's only on the SOQ. And then keep in mind, the only people that have control over the SOQ is the legislature. So they continually say, we fund SOQ, but then they move things in and out. And then, Jim Regenbaugh is a great resource on that. But that's why I think, some of these folks who come in at those levels like VML and VACO get to come in and say, hey, look, even regions are coming together and hosting forums like we're hosting now. And it bolsters, not to reuse the same word multiple times in conversation, but it just bolsters what folks have already been saying before. So yeah, and that's why I like the term common interest. But anyway, all that to say, I agree with exactly what you said. So sorry, thank you.
So if I could offer a suggestion, Mike, you articulated my number one concern is, so my first statement would be when evaluating the JLARC study, like, number one is don't take it from someplace else to fund public education, because that's, don't figure out another way to pay for it that doesn't impact localities, because the state is notorious for doing that. And so they're not gonna cut themselves, they're gonna cut us in another place and then redistribute it to public education.
And then take credit for it.
And then take credit for it.
100%, when, to your point, we're paying 60% of whatever the increase is, that they took 100%.
And then the bullet number 2 really impacts us today, but I think what happened as part of fixing what they've coined the calc tool error, some elected officials at the state level in our area, they think that the fix that happened at the end of the biennium, because that's what they were told, that it made us whole, but the math didn't quite math that way. And so they just don't know any better, because that's what they were told when they were making that legislative fix. So I think the JLARC study is very detailed, it's very long. So breaking our priorities down to the simplest level and not getting into how each of us run our school divisions, and if we're coming at it from the local government side, Hanover's numbers just work out to be very simple and in a round way. When the state gives a raise, they're only paying for 50% of the teachers and 50% of that raise. So we could all benefit on the local government side from having more flexibility in when you give us money, that we can use that money differently. And so if we focus on that, then to your point, we're not talking about at-risk or early childhood education or construction, and we're not getting into our individual needs. That gives each one of our individual board of supervisors more flexibility on how we want to deal with our local money. because that then gives us an expansion on local support. So I think it's sometimes that is the most difficult thing to explain to the state legislature, because they every year have a headline. Oh, we gave teachers a 7% raise. Well, you gave 50%
And then
of
you're,
the teachers,
and for us, it's
50%
only,
of a
they're
7%
only
raise
giving
for
us
half of a year.
40%. Plus, they take credit for all of it, and then our teachers come to us and say, the state just gave us 7%, what are you gonna do?
And to your point, and to everyone's point, it is that common interest item. This is a laundry list, this is not exhaustive, and certainly the items that are delineated. So it's for this time, because next year we'll be we'll be able to do and be but in this moment, what is that, or if there is a common interest area that does not negatively impact in the way that you've just described, but puts everybody in a more positive position, that certainly is one. And there are probably others as well. If we can't get to that in this moment, I hope we can. Then we talk about what's that path forward for this year as Central Virginia region or a regional group in terms of advocacy around
Could I offer,
education, so.
hearing what Sean has said about VML and VACO, who I think we all know, they develop their legislative priorities in the summer. I mean, I know Dr. Newbill has served on those committees, Counselor Addison has. So, their priorities were set long ago. All of our jurisdictions set our priorities long ago. And hearing what Mike said about, if we choose an item, we could end up accidentally regretting it if it gets too specific. I wonder if for this short term, VML and VACO are gonna stay laser focused on this topic, and we'll send out alerts of when they need advocacy from jurisdictions. The moment that it looks like the General Assembly is going along with the cut of the supplemental grocery tax, we will start hearing from VML and VACO and also from our full-time intergovernmental folks, hey, this is coming. This is the moment where, for some reason, we're all about to lose money and it seems like that's gaining momentum. That's the moment we need our elected officials to call their peers in the General Assembly and say, I don't know what the mix-up is. As our representative from Hanover was just saying, I don't know who convinced you that actually this is gonna make local governments whole. It's not, and we have these big concerns. And this group, especially realizing Goochland is not a part of VML or VACO, respect the independence. This group might facilitate making sure when the individuals in the groups already focused on those alarm bell moments, making sure the alarm bell gets rung more loudly, if that makes sense. When Richmond hears from Virginia First Cities, school construction funding just got sliced, we could share. Or when Henrico hears from VACO, we're talking about actually cutting at risk, or even when there's a positive moment, it looks as if the General Assembly's pushing to get back against the governor's version of re-benchmarking and be a good moment. It may be, I don't know if that's definitive enough, but it may be that the communication available in this group, given the fact that it doesn't seem like there's a chance to make a collective decision, this might serve more of a informing body.
I also think it's worth considering how if we can set up working relationships at the staff level to say the intergovernmental folks and the policy wonks among us, if we are able to collectively assess and analyze and better understand where something that might benefit one of us negatively impacts others, that would better inform all of our advocacy. Because I think what is powerful is the diversity politically, socioeconomically of our representation across our region in the General Assembly. And if we are able to, in one voice, acknowledge where there might be damage to one locality while benefiting another and trying to find the third way, that's what's unique, I think. I don't think that currently happens consistently across our region, where even representatives in the General Assembly who straddle locality lines are hearing very different things from people on either side. if we're able to work together on the staff side to say, okay, let's just get really granular on, where this cut might come. Is it benefiting any of us? Let's just make sure we're clear on that before we make recommendations on advocacy. But being able, if Dr. Newbill, if you're going to advocate to the General Assembly, being able to speak to the concerns of Hanover or Goochland in a conversation with somebody who's representing Richmond might make them stronger.
But being able to speak requires a agreement that we are going to work in that kind of way around advocacy to the extent that we get the information from the staff, but when we go over, and we haven't done that. And so that would be something I'd be interested whether or not, are we talking, how do,
I think we'd
Agreement around
probably,
that
to
one
Mike's
voice.
point, we'd probably have to have somebody meet
Yeah.
and have our people meet together. and
Right.
Agree that we agree or agree that we
Yes.
disagree. And then where we agree, we move forward together. And where we disagree, we agree to focus on the things we agree on.
I just,
That's-
adding to the conversation, there's been a lot of really great information shared, really great discussion, and I think, it's great to hear all of these things happening together collectively in this room among all of our regional jurisdictions. And so Mike mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we are in a unique position as well with our regional delegation. The representation has now reformed a Central Virginia Regional Caucus. And so Delegate McQuinn and Delegate Coiner have really pushed to have that come back together. And I think to the benefit of all of us, that's another platform.
you said they are reconvening?
They are reconvening. They met just
Okay.
before Christmas. And
Okay.
so, as those members are coming together, Northern Virginia has had a strong caucus representation among their members of the House and Senate, as well as the Hampton and Beach areas. And so I think that this is another unique opportunity for us to be able to share this information among those members as we're having conversations. And so, there's opportunity to the extent that we are, I think, maybe not as loud as some of these other localities have either somebody on staff or sending information down to the General Assembly, but I would say that Richmond and Chesterfield and Henrico have been working very closely, and to the extent that, partnering with Hanover too, just a little more informal gatherings as we are going downtown and trying to work these issues collectively. And so the fact, though, that we have now a larger representation here with 9 members, I think is just going to benefit the region further, for sure. But to Megan's point, working on, there's a communication base that we're establishing. And I think today that this is, again, this is a great platform for that to happen. As far as information sharing, communication of, when stuff drops. And also to Mike's point, we're still very early. There's not a whole lot to react to at the moment. And so while the governor's proposed budget certainly has some information in there that is concerning, we have to wait to see what the House and Senate are gonna drop, because I have to believe it's gonna be vastly different than what it is that we're looking at today. And so just being able to recognize we've got an open communication channel among the members of this group, I think is huge. And I don't know that, in my limited time in this role for Chesterfield, either, restarting something that maybe once was there in the past or having this new opportunity ahead of us is where we can really help propel our regional effort.
Thank you. I'm gonna go to Ms. Addison, and then I'm gonna press this a little bit, because I know that while we enjoy being here, the folks have some other things to
Sure.
attend to.
Just wanted to kind of chime in a little bit. I see us focusing on, how we fund, one of our shared priorities of education. And I know that's important for creating the workforce of tomorrow, how we're able to attract new, headquarter businesses and business sectors to come to our communities, because that's how we compete across the country. Is the strength of our education investment shows how we can prepare a workforce that people want to invest and bring jobs into the region. And that's, I think, the reason why the Transportation Planning Organization cares about education funding, because they all connect together. How they connect is, to your term in the beginning, I don't know if I said glacier pace. I just said this pace of government is usually slow, but it can be compared to a glacier, that's fine too. And I think the reason why I wanted to kind of chime in a little bit with this is, I also think while we're talking about how we are going to be spending money, we also have to think about how we make money. Our jurisdictions are very different in terms of our revenue strategies and how we're able to generate a new dollar to meet that demand for a hey, we're giving teachers raises, but only 50% if they qualify for this expectation. And oh, by the way, if you want to get this money, you've got to pay the rest. And then we're going, well, where are we going to get that from, right? And so to me, one of the challenges we have in the Dillon Rule state is technically, if the state doesn't tax it first, we can't tax it second without permission. And so in that, we are limited by what we can do to even meet these growing needs. And I'm concerned from looking at trends in the past, we could make all these demands of what we want to see funding for education come back in, and it's the same formula. We'll give you half as long as you match the half. And then we're going to be dealing with the same situation of trying to keep up and catch up. And we're all going to be fighting over the same challenges, but the same thing is, I believe we got to look at some other aspects too, where are our biggest revenue sources in our localities coming from mostly? And I think we could say a lot of it's coming from homeowners, developments in that capacity. And there's a presentation done at VML this year that I really enjoyed, where it said the average revenue per household versus the average cost per child in school don't match. And that difference has to be made up somehow. And in today's day and age, that's where you're seeing mixed use, multifamily, other commercial uses being added to our projects to make sure we're able to fill in that gap. And I don't think we explain that properly in an economic format, because that formula makes sense. If your household only pays 10 grand a month a year or 12 grand a year in actual taxes, and it costs us $15,000 to educate your child, I need $3,000 from somewhere. And that's just for education funding. We're not even talking about everything else we've got to do. And so the reason why I want to bring this up is we have to look at things that are going to be supporting this overdue evaluation of investment in our children, because we had to scramble together to figure out how to create the CBTA funding sources. And we're looking at losing a really important one in sales tax and some other changes to the grocery tax that we've depended on for a long time. But what does that mean tomorrow? But more importantly, what does it mean in the next 10 years? Because this is not going to change overnight. If they're not giving us a way to recoup that revenue as a locality, we're already in a disadvantage. And so my concern is, while we look at this, I also think we can look at what are some things that are going to be dependable revenue sources that we can either tweak, change, add to, diversify how we make revenue. Because when you look at the formula, as I kind of do as a nerd, is take back and go, okay, if we spend that X, where does it come from? And how do I make Y bigger so that next year when I know that more X is coming or needed, I can meet that gap? And right now, in an economy where interest rates are where they are, inflation is coming down a little bit from what the Fed says, but we don't know what that means for the future. If our growth is dependent on construction, and we're not gonna be getting a lot more construction right away, then how are we gonna meet that demand of what could be coming down the pipe? And that's a question I believe is also a bigger picture ask. Because it doesn't seem like what I'm hearing from the General Assembly or from what I'm hearing from the governor's office, that they understand how we make a dollar from a local capacity to meet those demands they put in our budgets, to do what they decide is what's needed for our investments. And that's just the thing I feel like needs to be added, because all the concerns I hear raised are completely valid. But unless we're gonna be given some flexibility and some ways we can generate revenue as localities, I don't know how it's sustainable to keep doing the can kicking, as Ms. Bircher mentioned on there, any longer, because we're seeing slowdowns in multiple sectors across our city. And truthfully, one of the problems Richmond has is, while we've been successful in opening new businesses, unless they sell something, it's just in their office. I don't get beephole business taxes on anything if there's just an operating center like CarMax is built in here. I love that they're working here, but if they're not selling anything, I don't make any money. And so one of the challenges we get into is how do we grow those pieces together, because it does matter. And so for me, that's just one of the comments I wanted to add to the complexity of what we're talking about. But I do love that we are gathering as a conversation in this type of setting with these members, because I don't think we're alone. I saw some head nods in what I was explaining, but that's what I see as the problem moving forward.
So I want to say thank you, that those are definitely major points. We definitely need to consider how we're generating the dollars. I am going to, because we're not going to get to that today, Mr. Addison. But we should build that in to our future discussions as we move forward. Today, what I want to ask, if we would consider it, based on what I've heard and level of readiness, that we might consider, loosely, planned RVA legislative entity that gets periodic updates, whether that's bi-weekly, weekly, et cetera, from our staffing and folks who are at the General Assembly, who are monitoring for us in the way that you talked about, Mike, that can then say, hey, this is what's happening here this time. We need people to, from this, again, I'm just gonna plan RVA legislative caucus, I'll use that language, how about that, okay? Yeah,
Just so that, you're,
that's not embracing, just
no,
agreeing
no, no.
to be on call and queue, to be responsive relative, as we're being advised from staff, I think in the way Megan was talked about.
I'm 100% there. I just wanna
Okay.
make sure that in we have in essence 60 days
Yes,
to process a new state budget and 3,000 bills. I'm 100% on what you're asking for. What I don't wanna do is have to do it twice in a
Oh,
period
no.
where I may not have time.
right.
And if the Central Virginia Caucus, which is gonna include all of us, is gonna be meeting, and I'm sure
Is it?
as elected officials, y'all will be getting the invitations to come to those meetings also. If maybe we could overlap those two things, so that instead of having to, not be at a committee meeting where we need to be working on something, or in a senator or delegate's office lobbying for something, and having to go to this meeting, and going to another meeting to say the same thing, if we could just kind of tie those two things together maybe.
So the only other thing I'd like to add to it is that I picked up that I didn't have before this meeting, which is why I think it's good for us to meet together, is we each get what our jurisdiction thinks is going on in Richmond for our jurisdiction. What we don't get is what Hanover or what Henrico or what Richmond sees is going on and how it's gonna affect them. And in general, honestly, for the most part, we've all been just focused on what is it, how's it gonna affect us? And it may or may not change my position to know what's going on and how it's affecting Henrico. But if we're gonna work as a regional body, at least if we understand how it's affecting each other and we can share that information as you're giving it to your jurisdiction, if everyone's willing to share that information, we can at least understand why when we're asking for something, you're going, what the hell are you asking for that for? That's not gonna, that's bad. And we're like, why is it bad? And we don't know why, because we don't know why it's affecting you. And I think if we don't get anything else out of what happened today, if we can figure out how to share with each other why something could be good for one place and not good for another, and figure out how, in the end, we're all gonna vote what is gonna best benefit our jurisdiction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that collectively it's not benefiting us more than it would if we looked at it just from our viewpoint. And I think if we can share that information with each other, we might actually make a big step as a region.
Well, that's where the briefings would come into me, so that we'd have them periodically, and it's not, it's across the 9, to say, to your point, this is what it is on whatever the item, and we know that, and then what it is we will individually do or as a group going over to be advocates in Overland, because we don't want to duplicate efforts.
Could I offer
Yeah.
a potential path forward? I think probably what Mike is internally sweating, which I shared a little bit of the anxiety of, is how ad hoc the General Assembly works. I can't tell you how often you schedule a meeting and then cancel it 12 times. Well, I could tell you, you've experienced it I mean, I think probably many of our elected officials have been lined up to speak to a committee, which meets 30 minutes after another committee, which meets 30 minutes after adjournment. And you're spending 12 hours of your day doing nothing except waiting to talk for 30 seconds. And I wonder if in terms of formal briefings that'll take to make them worthwhile, like what, I mean, Miss Bircher's, who's gone, probably because she's at a different committee, to make her presentation worthwhile, she had to put a lot of hours into that. And I wonder if we could do ad hoc updates during session and plan for a post session in light of the committee really digging into the weeds for November briefing, so that staff at that point actually has the time to make it worthwhile to you all. And then also add to that, the Central Virginia Regional Caucus adds some more formal briefing at that time. So we don't end up promising briefings that just get canceled or that frankly are thrown together in 12 minutes before the meeting and waste your busy time, or maybe ad hoc's not enough.
Well, I'm not even saying we necessarily have to meet as a group
And it can be
during the
virtual,
session,
yeah.
because to your point, I know, I've seen it from our view, y'all are gonna be tied up. But y'all are giving information back to your jurisdiction during the whole thing. And what I'm asking is, does it make sense for us not just to give Chesterfield's information back to Chesterfield, but to give it to the 9 localities and vice versa?
Right, in the
And-
context of,
And to me, understanding that and understanding why, I mean, let's face it, if it's good for 8 out of 9 of us, we're probably gonna do it. I mean, we're, as a region, even if one of us is gonna be mad, and that might be Chesterfield that's mad, but if it's gonna benefit 1 or 2 of us, then that 1 or 2 needs to go fight that battle, not this region. And we need to know from your updates, if we can understand that, I think we can learn how to work together better.
and that, to your point, that's why I'm saying, again, I'm loosely calling it Plan RVA Regional Caucus, that we get those updates, but we plan that they can be virtual. We're not gonna all be able to come into, it could be virtual, what's happening, whomever, and then what are the implications in terms of anything we need to do in terms of going over. But to have it be organized in a way that the legislature is clear that we're coming and bringing a voice around issues. So that's where the strength is.
May I add that
So-
one place where we may consider beginning, with the JLARC recommendations, a lot of assumptions are made about what the fiscal impact will be both locally and on the state. And however, after consulting with Matthew in his familiarity with RPS, one of the things that came to him about the recommendations around the support cap. And I said, well, this looks like it would cost Richmond an additional $20 million. Like, do we tell people to advocate for that if it increases our impact? He said, Eva, we're already paying for that.
And
Like,
see,
we-
Chesterfield's
and
already
so-
paying for it too. So
but you don't see it in
it
the
says in the
report.
JLARC impact, Chesterfield had to pay $126 million more.
Mm.
But when they actually analyzed what we're already paying, we were actually looking at like maybe 1 or 2 million more for $229 million.
So-
And that's like,
If we if our individual locality staff could do actually drill down on what the actual fiscal impact would be locally, that may be a value add for the entire region to say, we have the JLARC report, we see what the state impact would be, but what is the actual local fiscal impact based on what we're already spending, not based on what the calculation on local effort is? And then that at least builds awareness of
Then
folks.
where do we go from there?
Yeah.
I'm trying to have the
Yeah, I
path
hear you.
forward. I need a path
I just
forward.
think in terms of.
So
grant.
that is, you started with JLARC, and that's always there. So if staffs go back, take a look at the implications for the particular jurisdiction, we're sharing that information, and then,
Well, then that, we would defer to the elected bodies, but that
Okay,
way
so
we're at
that
least at the
comes back
local level
to-
saying, here's what
Right.
the actual impact would be, you all decide what your priorities are.
and that gets back to the informing then of implications for each of and we know that and understand that as we go across the street.
As, hearing what everybody has to say too, I'm not sure, maybe Mike or Suzanne correct me, but when you BMO and Baco, when there's a hot bill that comes up, or there's a budget item that, is raising red flags, they send out these alerts. And so I'm not sure if what we're asking is maybe any different from what is already happening under some other avenues. And so to the
Okay.
extent that once we're receiving that information too, we can ensure that everybody is
but
getting
what those organizations don't do is say that, what they do is say that this group of people in general agrees with this, and that's the path we're marching forward, but they don't say what the effects are negatively to a small group of the people that are actually going, oh, well, on this particular VACO item, we're we're gonna get screwed on this, even though everybody else is good. And that's what I'm saying regionally is how can we learn from each other how to, at least what the impact is, it may or may not change our decision, honestly, because we're all gonna still function with what is gonna be what our jurisdiction needs in the end.
But it's the first time that
It's
we're
the
taking
way
it.
that we try to understand our neighbor.
Sure.
Quick question, just so that
Sure.
I'm clear on the expectation. I'm happy to create something that kind of answers your question, but my up to make to my board is gonna be between me and my board, as it should be between Natalie and her board and the city and council and whatever. Cause there's communication that has to be there that's kind of in that family, if you will. To Natalie's point, some of this is already being done, and I'm happy to cut, copy, and paste, happy to forward, whatever it is that needs to be in the document you're looking for. The second part of my question is, we started talking about education, and I heard you just now broaden this almost universally. And I wanna make sure that as we're talking here, are we talking about an update on education as it relates to these things and an update? Or are you talking what I thought I heard, which was a universally broad legislative update?
For me, we came to this in the meeting around education. That was the focus. The JLOC study, the governor's budget, I mean, as it was raised in our Plan RVA meeting, it was very specific in terms of education.
And I'll agree that what you heard me say accurately, which was a broader scope on that. Not because I'm trying to broaden what we came to meet about today, but I was trying to find the place where we can actually, education is where I thought, and I still think, we have the most ability to work together, to come around and coalesce together with. But I also heard that there was a time where this body got hurt working together because they started infighting. And I'm not gonna say that some of this couldn't cause an infight, because it could. But if we don't understand each other and where we're coming from, what our needs are, we're more likely to have infighting than we are if we don't. And so I did kind of broaden it, and that may not be fair, especially right now, especially with everything that's about to happen in the next several months. But it may be a fair topic to talk about when session's over.
Can I throw out maybe
Sure.
a couple comments? I heard the cautionary tale of the time before, because I wasn't here, and Mike might be one of the only people in the room that was actively involved in that. I think one of the challenges that we faced at that time was a lack of capacity at Plan RVA to be able to do what was being asked and potentially expected, and maybe a little bit of some overzealousness on our part. I think we're coming into this conversation with a much clearer sense of what our capacity is and where our boundaries are. Just to put that on the table from the executive perspective. I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity to lean into what I've heard today that is a pretty strong relationship and set of communication that's already happening among our three largest jurisdictions in the region. And to really just talk with you all, I think Eva, you suggested this earlier, I mean, maybe there's just an opportunity for staff to talk over the next couple of weeks about, are there points of contact in the smaller jurisdictions that could be looped into the fold in some way, shape, or form? I mean, we have, other jurisdictions here, some that are not here, that we could reach out to and just say, what level of involvement can you have in this very fast-moving environment? I would say that I don't know if our vice chair is on the phone still right now, but I think we could talk about whether or not at our February meeting, whether or not it might be appropriate to do a post-session debrief and have our experts come to the commission and do some kind of a
Mid-session. it's a long year, so we'll still, the General Assembly will still be.
Well, I think given our meeting schedule, we're not gonna meet until April, so we'll be, well, anything could happen, right? It still, it could be mid-session.
Don't put that in the universe.
So sorry. Yeah, we could do a briefing, I think, at a future commission meeting, more from an educational perspective, I think less so about positioning advocacy, but more just to kind of, in that spirit of information sharing. And I think what I'm hearing today is that there's a desire, if capacity exists, to be able to amplify the voice to the 9 localities. But we have to recognize that the staff capacity is varied. And so I think that that's a space that potentially Plan RVA could play to help work to identify who those other duties as assigned people might be. And how do we best connect with them so that they can dial in as they can, but also aren't biting off more than they can handle. I mean, would that be
It does.
two maybe points that leaning into the regional caucus that's forming, I would assume that we can subscribe to the updates and try to push that out to the other jurisdictions that don't have somebody who can track that. And then committing to having a future, maybe like post-session debrief or update, whatever that looks like in the timeline, to be able to talk about where particularly this issue is heading, because it does sound like there's an opportunity to really think about what collective mobilization could happen after the committee's formed and heading into November. It feels like those are sort of 3 things that this group is kind of coalesced around being viable. If I'm hearing.
Personally, I love it.
Yeah.
That works.
Yeah, I guess I use, CVTA as a model of our potential to come together. That doesn't mean that it was without,
Angst.
yeah. But it is clear to me that we can and we're stronger by virtue of having done so. And so it's then in this kind of area, how we move there. While I wanted to move faster than the glacier, that Mr. Addison's talked about, I want it yesterday, I'm also realistic. And so what you're suggesting, I think is probably gonna be the best path forward, because we want all of the 9 to be in and to be well organized when we go, so. So the next meeting would be, or the first briefing would be when?
Back to some convening of this group,
Probably
I would-
after session.
Yeah, I would, I mean, I would say
We
this.
can have some maybe sub conversations, but
Staff could get together in the interim, I mean, we could do
For
virtual
sure.
meetings of staff just to run through, I mean, even just orient each other to what our priorities are legislatively for this session. I mean, I think even on that very base level, or things that we didn't prioritize and why, you know.
And I think, staff's already, we're scheduling, I know Natalie, Mike, Suzette are in touch all the time, and exactly to Martha's point, for the, if we've got a metaphor of glacier for us, there are little boats that are moving rapidly, and that's Suzette, Mike, and Natalie, who are skirting around quickly. So if we can loop in more of those rapidly moving boats to make sure that as they're moving in real time, they're in touch, and to the extent that
I will say
as an
that
extended
the full commission meets on the 8th of February. I realize that that's 3 days before crossover, but I mean, that might be a good benchmark that I think the full commission could benefit from, just a review that this group convened and sort of what's happened, and I think we could provide some kind of a staff report about where
Right.
things
Where
things seem to look at
That's a good
heading into
point.
crossover. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, at least then we'll know more about what the 2 houses, well, I guess we'll know.
There's lots
We'll
we
know
don't
more.
know, but we will know more.
So February 8th, there'll be,
We could plan, I mean, I'm just thinking about in the spirit of everyone's time.
No,
That is a date that at
no,
least our
I'm not
commissioners
questioning,
would
I'm
already
just
be
trying
together.
to tie it
do
down.
you
plan
guys
to
think
have-
that that's a good date for, or do you think that that's a day that's gonna be really tough for you because you're still gonna be slammed trying to take care of something other than?
Yeah, we've been across it.
I just wanted to
I mean, cause we might need to move our meeting date week or something if it's more advantageous to make it all work.
Right. Matthew, what do you?
I wanted to offer that Richmond Public Schools is going to be planning a lobby day on February 7th. And that is something that we would be happy to expand to be more of a regional education lobby day if folks have an interest in us kind of branding that a little bit differently as we start to publicize that. I don't know if everybody is going to, if we did that and folks come down to Richmond for a February 7th date, maybe that would be an opportunity for a short meeting as well if we don't want to take time on the 8th.
Can I?
Just wanted to throw that into the mix, if that's okay.
I suspect folks have decision about lobby days within the various jurisdictions.
Every day's lobby day.
Well, yes.
I meant where you bring, that's
a bumper sticker right there.
Yeah, that's true. The gym. That is true, but the larger grouping, all of the stakeholders. I want to go back to Martha, because I really do want to leave here with a path forward. I like that idea, and if people are interested in that, we could figure out, but we need a point person who is, saying, okay, staff, who are gonna be getting together to get information that comes to us. I think that's some of what you were saying, or am I adding to your list?
Well, we gotta be careful, because it's not really a plan RVA function.
No.
We need to figure out how this committee actually works going forward.
Right, I was just trying to get back to what Martha was offering before, so I could be clear about that.
I think,
Dr. Newbill, I'm sorry, my apologies.
I was waiting for the voice to come.
Well, I mean, we have facilitated a lot of things with great success at Plan RVA. Hosting forums for people to come in to meet on all kinds of issues. As you recall, we had the Wilder programs coming in this summer and things like that. Is it too much to place on Martha's plate to be the point person for the information coming in? And then, of course, she can delegate out. I mean, Martha, would that be a problem for you to be the point person and delegate it out to the staff as you see fit to be facilitated?
Are you all comfortable
To your
with?
point, we don't want you to overcommit to something like you talked about earlier.
Yeah,
So we need you to be honest with us
I
as you
think
answer.
I think I heard something earlier that I want to just be clear on. If the expectation is to be able to support increased communication and to bring information to some jurisdictions that might not have as ready access to it, whether that's a forward of a VACO email or what have you, or maybe even a context that says read this one, because the VACO emails are a lot.
Yes.
That is something that we can do.
That's-
We cannot participate in the advocacy process.
No, that's not, no,
So
it
if
was
it's
more of the-
about just making sure that the kind of connective tissue gets strengthened over the next, 60, 90 days, and then we reassess what worked and didn't, then I think we can commit to that.
Right, it's the communication and the connective tissue, but having that is a role that.
And in the
plan-
spirit of the local
Could-
technical
right.
assistance that, we are committed to providing to our jurisdictions.
I don't wanna speak for my counterparts, and I know the staffing difficulties, and I don't know that I don't wanna overstep my lane, if you will, but also your staff may not necessarily be the most plugged into the minutia of what's happening there. I'm glad to work with my counterparts if y'all are open to it, to kind of, at some point when I got 2 points here. Whenever that appropriate time is, putting together something that we can send to you that then go out to your other folks.
Right.
Also, in the spirit of your efforts to kind of move forward with a plan, the date is what's kind of giving me a little angst at the moment. If maybe the plan could be that we collectively work with Martha to figure out a date to do this, and maybe it overlaps with the Central Virginia Caucus.
Okay.
Maybe it doesn't, it's just the timing, getting in, that crossover is that period of time where a body can no longer act on its own stuff. And what happens is all the low-hanging fruit gets done first. So all these things that we care most passionately about are gonna happen in a very short period of time at the
Okay.
end.
Okay.
And I feel an obligation to my my board and my manager to make sure I keep my priorities, keep the most important things, because their name is on my paycheck. Make sure that happens first, and I also at the same time don't wanna half-ass a product for you either. And so maybe if y'all.
Mr. Sherman, we'll take technical expertise and free labor as if you offer. We got no issue. Yeah, no, that's a yes.
So I would say yes, and it seems to all come together. Martha,
Yeah.
communication, connection,
Yeah, and I'll
connectivity,
also-
but with the entities work in the way that you're suggesting to get information, and also coming up with a date that makes sense, given what's happening in the General Assembly, that, that could happen, but that would come to us through,
I'll give
If
you
that-
some report on the 8th of February,
yeah,
whether
that would be
it's
great.
substantial or not. But I think we can give a report on where we are in this process.
And what might be a better date
Yeah.
For the
based on the
next,
conversation
Yeah,
for that
I think we
kind
can figure
of
that out.
briefing?
cause I understand your point, and
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I mean, everyone's comments have been just,
And I have a question again, just for my own edification, because I've heard two different things. Are we specifically talking about collective understandings around what's happening with the manifestations of what we would like in the JLR court? Or are we talking about just the broad host of 3,000 bills and a budget?
I have a perspective, if I can.
Please.
I think it would be wise for us to stay focused on the JLARC report,
absolutely.
to practice what this could look like. I'm a little bit worried that if it's too big and too broad, we
Then it
just
loses
won't
its
be able to
Right,
be
because
successful on
JLARC is
anything.
big and broad enough by itself.
And that's why I just want to be
Yes.
clear, if we're gonna create something for you, that we're gonna give you what you're
Now,
expecting, and you don't look at us and go, hey, wait a minute, that's not what I wanted.
I would say that while I don't know of anything that's on my mind right now, perhaps the only other broadening that we might think about would be related to transportation, just simply because of the infrastructure that already exists on that particular topic.
And I think we're probably already there, just kind of willing to, work there. I just wanted to make sure if it's education and transportation we're already gonna be doing here. Education is fine.
The education is the piece that's being
The universe
added.
of things, that's gonna require a whole different approach, but.
It's education, but starting with I think with all the discussion with the JLARC study, so that, that at least gives us, guardrails, parameters, if you will.
You got it? I'm happy, please.
Okay, so on the 8th, Martha, we will have some update, is that correct?
Yeah.
The body, plan RVA
Yeah,
body.
yeah, I mean, well,
And then-
if that's okay with Mr. Davis, we'll include a recap of where we are.
Chair Davis, would that be okay with you?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you both.
Okay, and then there'll be the subsequent discussion in terms of.
They'll let us
Yeah.
know when we should have
Yeah.
our next meeting, and I'm good with
Yes,
that.
yeah. Okay,
Thank you. I
Thank
know we
you.
were way longer probably than we
No,
meant to be, but this is
Yeah.
really actually, in my opinion, a great way to try to help each other, our neighbor, move forward with us, because ultimately we're stronger together.
and it's always more of an investment of time on the front end when you're beginning an effort, and so it's not unexpected. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
If any of y'all are interested, we do have the JLARC study that was presented to Chesterfield. And I don't know if that could help any of you to see how that can happen. We have it printed, and we also can Martha has it digitally, so if you want it, you can reach out to her and she can send it to you digitally as well.
Yeah, digitally would be better.
Okay, Martha can do that to you.
Yeah, we'll post the digital copies.
Okay.
Simply just,